Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Five podcast. I am once again joined by Florian. Glad to have you here, Florian.
Glad to be here.
All right, so we are discussing now another, what I consider to be a very good introduction to information theory. Werner gets the in the beginning was information. So, one thing I think you might have appreciated, Florian, as a German, was his very meticulous attention to detail.
Yeah, that's true. Also his dialect. I think he came from East Prussia. Was born in East Prussia in 1937.
So,
Yeah,
what was your
that's his
thought of?
base.
So, what was your thought of the presentation and the argument from information.
I think presentation was very good. Um, uh, the charming German accent notwithstanding, and it's pretty strong when he says that basically evolution and Big Bang are wrong or are basically declares them as false. But it's true. I mean, if we say, I think there's not even, it's very difficult from science alone to come to a causal to derive some form of causal origin or some causal effect how the universe came into being, because then you always go back into the next. You basically can kick the can down the road, right? And so um, probably cannot create new information from itself. You need some external structure that that shows the way, basically.
Yeah, so I took notes, which we can I can turn to in a moment. But the really essential thing here is that he begins with a quotation from Norbert Wiener, who published Cybernetics in 1948, where Wiener states that information is not matter or energy, but some other substance. And that's now 80 years ago. That's insane that this is still something that has not yet percolated into the discourse, because this is where the computer revolution begins. This is not somebody you can just ignore. And so the idea then becomes, one, why, but I think we already know why. The next follow up then is, okay, what else do we know about information? He briefly mentioned Shannon, where the idea you have to have a sender, a signal, and the receiver. With Shannon, a couple things. Information, once sent, is either preserved or lost. To get more information, you have to have another sender. So, if I send, Florian a series of tweets, pretty high likelihood the information will not be lost, which is good. But unless when I stop sending him tweets, he won't get anything. Right. So, in that regard, with information theory, it's like you have to have a sender. Once we now realize that DNA is a code with four letters that we can use in three-letter segments, three-letter word segments, I should say. Then the question is, okay, who wrote the code and then who sent the information? Now, in light of Shannon, and then also we'll get to a little bit later, Viner himself has his own very specific definition for information. And one of the things that I liked in his introduction to what is a scientific law, he says a definition in science must be precise and very clear. It must be sharp, distinct borders that include only the subjects of the definition and exclude everything else. That right there, I think, is a very good summary of what a scientific law should be.
Yes, and it reminded me a little bit of what we discussed with our one of our biochemistry professors back when I was still studying in the 90s. So one important so-called second messenger, which is like a messenger molecule that the body uses to relay information. Calcium ions are a second messenger, and the question why is because calcium alone is toxic for the cells. So you can only have a very small amount of calcium, and for that reason, you can have small calcium spikes that make a real difference, right? So they're noticed. If you cannot use sodium or potassium as a signaling molecule, although they are really important for the process in our body, but you can't use them to signal because they're there in such an abundance that you cannot work with small fluctuations. But since calcium is very restricted inside the cells, small fluctuations can be used to transmit information. And when we use the classical concept of or statistical view of what entropy is, basically, if you will, the opposite of information. Entropy is the number of states that a system can take in, and you take the logarithm of that and multiply it with the so-called Boltzmann constant. So if an entropy can be an absolute number, and it basically stands for how disordered a system is, right? So if you want information, you basically cannot make a system more disordered. You need to have some form of order there, and it needs to be a very specific and very fine-tuned peak of information that comes in. And that's very difficult to imagine that it comes out of the system itself, right? There has to be a very clear and a very clear and sharp peak of something new, something ordered in the system. And calcium ions, as one example, is one of these ordered versions, because you only can accept a very small influx of calcium into the cells. That's why it functions as a signaling molecule. But if you just change the disordered status of a system to like a little bit more disordered status, you cannot transmit any information. And that's what I thought about when Git talked about that.
Nice. Okay, so for given his definition of a scientific law, he says 5 criteria need to be met in order to say that we are dealing with the subject domain of information. This thing must have statistics, which he calls signal, number, and symbols, syntax, set of symbols, grammar, semantics, meaning, pragmatics, action, and apobatics, purpose, result. So he gives that little interesting clip of the butterfly wings where you have what looks like letters and numbers, but that's not statistics. That's just, nature doing something. And so he then goes through a series of examples saying, okay, this, according to this definition, isn't information. From this definition, he then has 10 results that he says follow, 10 conclusions. 1, anything material, such as physical chemical processes, cannot create something non-material. 2, information is a non-material fundamental entity and not a property of matter. 3, information requires a material medium for storage and transmission. 4, information cannot originate in statistical processes. 5, there can be no infinite information without a code. 6, all codes result from an intentional choice and arrangement between sender and recipient. 7, the determination of meaning for and from a set of symbols is a mental process that requires intelligence. 8, there can be no new information without an intelligence, purposeful sender. 9, any given chain of information can be traced back to an intelligent source. And then finally, 10, information comprises the non-material foundation for all technological systems, works of art, and biological systems. So is there anything you want to comment on, Florian, on these 10 conclusions that he claims follows from his definition?
It's very interesting that information itself cannot arise from matter, but it's also interesting that he says information itself cannot arise from energy, while you would say that energy would be, you could see energy as one form of transmitting. Not only energy can be the form of matter, or it can also be the form of light, for example, or other particles that don't have any mass, right? So basically, a photon does have a mass, but has no mass that you can. If you freeze a photon, it has no mass, right? It only gains mass by movement, but and you can calculate that. But that is energy, right? And it is and it's interesting to say that that energy and matter itself cannot be information. That information needs to be outside of that. And I guess it's a little bit like money, right? You pay with money. Money is an information in a way, right? That basically proves how much money you have or how wealthy you are. But you don't need to see money to know that someone is wealthy.
Yes. And so the importance here of this statement has to be reiterated. This is not a pronouncement from a creationist. This is a pronouncement from Norbert Wiener, who wrote the 1948 Cybernetics. And he was giving the opinion of the scholarly community at that time, which within the realm of information theory, I don't think anybody's changed. Where there's quote pushback unquote is from what we would call biological evolution, so selection for traits within biological processes, but also the chemical to biological leap with abiogenesis, because where does this information come from? Now, a few things I want to say here are that once you understand that information is not matter or energy, because matter and energy are convertible, the idea that then becomes but we also know this from a test. Okay, let's say you have a computer program that shows you a GIF that says SOS. And then suppose you watch a movie where somebody's, putting SOS on maybe, stones on a beach. And then you have an actual person spelling out SOS with stones on a beach. The message is the same, whether it's a computer, the TV, or some guy flying in an airplane looking down at the beach. But the medium in which that information is expressed is different. Now, that shows us it's not material, because if it were material, we wouldn't expect that to be the case. How could you have the same thing and all the same meaning in all three instances in three different mediums? The thing he points to is if you were to delete a hard drive of a computer, it wouldn't weigh any less. So he says information doesn't have mass. That's where he tries to provide experimental evidence that information is not a material thing, because by purging a hard drive, you don't, it doesn't weigh any less, because it's not a material thing. And so, and lastly, I would also argue as proof that information isn't material is material goods or material objects are scarce. And by scarce, I mean they're rivalrous. So if I want to eat a cheeseburger and you want to eat the same cheeseburger, Florian, we both can't eat the same cheeseburger. One is going to have to decide who gets to eat what. And furthermore, if enough people go to a burger joint, they might overload the productive capacity of the burger joint to make cheeseburgers. Whereas information isn't like that. If I want to consider a mathematical formula, you could consider the same mathematical formula. And my consideration of it doesn't prevent you from considering it, nor does the supply diminish. In fact, the whole world could contemplate the exact same mathematical formula, and not only does no one exclude anybody else from doing it, the supply hasn't been diminished. So for these three reasons, I argue that information cannot be material as well for experimental data.
Yeah, that's very convincing. Especially since you can multiply information very, very easily without any adverse consequence, any cost, if you will, right? I would say that a hard drive can still weigh a little less if you delete the information on it, because maybe it does weigh something, but it's just such a low weight that we can't really measure it, or we would need to go into the quantum realm to measure it. But what is it? What is a hard drive? What is that? I mean, sure, in a hard drive you write some information on a magnetic tape, but maybe even easier when you have a computer chip like RAM that stores information. That information gets stored by how relays are basically how relays are on how gates, logical gates inside the chip are adjusted, right? So something comes in like a packet of information comes in, and then finds a gate, and the gate switches to a different state. But the gate still has the same weight as before, right? It's now just a different state. So if you think about a system that has information like let's say you have an empty hard drive, right? So it's all zeros everywhere. All the little blocks, all the little quarters have all zeros, and now you start put information in it. So that means some of these blocks get now ones, right? One, then it's 1 1 0 1 0 1 1 1 0, and so on and so forth. Whether there's a 1 or a 0, the thing weighs the same, indeed. It's just that the little flip is going into a different direction, right? It's basically that field inside the chip has now a different state, but it's not weighing any different. Yeah, that's the way you can explain it. Yes.
And so I think what's so important here for both his argument and other both intelligent design and creationists arguments is information is not material. And then not only that, information needs to have a sender. One of the points he says is it's not the result of statistics. So the idea is you have to have, and again, let's just use, I think in Shannon's day it would have been like the radio. So you have a guy with a radio who's sending out a message. So here we go. Let's put it this way. There was in one of the debates which we did not watch, but I've seen many debates with Lennox and atheists, and Lennox says, "Well, let's say you're reading a newspaper, and then you want to, and then you read the headline. Now, if you were to describe to me the chemical content of the ink in the paper, you did not thereby describe to me the information in the headline, and in fact, no amount of looking into that would ever tell you what the information in the headline does not come from the ink, the chemical components of the ink. It comes from the fact that somebody wrote that headline up and then printed it in the newspaper. That's why you have that information. And it's not the result of the chemical content of the ink, right? And it's not the result of the chemical content of the paper. And so that's the other important takeaway is it has to be the result of some. Now, the one thing I would say about his claims later on, which we'll get to, is that if you're a theistic evolutionist, you could say, well, God just inserted information at these various points. But then the main argument he's making against here is materialistic evolution, not theistic evolution. And there's a whole different set of arguments can be made for that.
But even if God inserted himself and gave the world information, how that information doesn't change, doesn't add any mass to the world. So how would you explain God from a material worldview where that basically has the same weight whether there's information or not? Information cannot be part of our material world, therefore. There must be something else.
Yeah, let me just re-explain. Theistic evolutionists tend to be Christians who argue that God used evolution. So that particular group could just freely admit information comes from outside of the material world. But that's a different group that's not being directly addressed in this lecture.
Yeah, but I agree. But I mean, if you think about it, where else than any God would this information come from that we have? Or I mean, how we exactly?
Yeah,
so that's a very convincing point. And before the talk, before I saw this the lecture and thought about it, I wouldn't have really thought about that angle of spirituality, if you will, right? Because I thought ultimately, and that's also a view that many spiritual people embrace. For example, when you say, I'm taking ayahuasca, for example, or I'm regularly taking LSD or something like that, and that allows me to make contact with God. That may well be, but that gets you to the conclusion that maybe God is just energy that somehow percolates through the world, and that can clearly not be true. I mean, ultimately, information that we have is doesn't have any is not part of any matter or any energy. So maybe there's something percolating, but it's not. And it may be God's will that's percolating through the world, but it is not. It's not seen by anything that is made out of matter or energy.
Yeah. Well, let me put this. Let's put this another way too, to make it a little more comprehensible to somebody. Let's say that you find a working computer with a line of code that's running, and it's say running a video game. Now, if you were to say that granted the computer's plugged in to electricity, right? And you were to say the electricity is the cause of this, that would only be partly true because electricity is causing the whole program to run. But you wouldn't be correct to say that electricity is the cause of the code itself that is being run, nor is it imaginable how it could be. How could some force, energy, electricity, be the source of the code? It can't. You can't give an account of how it could. So for those people who would like to argue that God is like a force, like you see a lot of Eastern theology, or even some pagan philosophy like Plato, that can't be, because if I want to say a book's been written or a computer code's been written or there's an engraving on some artifact, I'm not going to say that was done by lightning. I'm not going to say that was done by gravity or magnetism. Forces don't do that. We know this, right? Forces don't do that. Humans do. And of course, this is where we get this strange inconsistency, right? So the Darwinist wants to say, okay, let's look at all natural processes as they are and then telescope them back. But if we look at information creation, all observable evidence shows that it takes a will. In this case, the human will. So we have two categories of objects: those which we observe the information being added into, and those which we don't. Those which we do are always done by an intelligence. So the obvious conclusion is those that we don't must also be from an intelligence, just one that we haven't seen.
Yeah.
All right. Now, he then, okay, so now we move to the DNA part. He says, okay, DNA, he uses, 3-letter words, and he says that using his definition of information, we can then come to quite a few. I think he has a total of 10 conclusions. I don't know if we need to go through all 10, but a few are interesting. He says, since the DNA code of life forms is clearly within the definition of information, we conclude there must be a sender. Since the density and complexity of the DNA encoded information is billions of times greater than man's present technology, we conclude the sender must be supremely intelligent. 3, since the sender must have encoded, stored the information into the DNA molecules, constructed the molecular biomachines required for the encoding, decoding, and synthesizing processes, and design all the features for the original life forms, the sender must be purposeful and supremely intelligent. Let's see. 4, since information is non-material foundational entity and cannot originate from material quantities, we must conclude that the sender must have a non-material component, spirit. And then 5, since information is non-material fundamental entity and cannot originate from material quantities, and since information also originates from man, we conclude that man's nature must have non-material component, spirit. So let's just stop with these first 5. I think all of these follow pretty naturally from the assumptions. Is there anything that you'd like to weigh in on here, Florian?
I'm just wait a second. No, I mean, let's just go through them. Then I can maybe weigh in.
Sure. Okay, let's do the first one then. The premise 1 is that there's a sender because there's a sender for the information we find in DNA.
Yeah.
Okay. Premise 2 is that since the information density storage is so much greater than modern man's, that sender must be quantitatively more intelligent than humans.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and then because the DNA is itself a molecular biomachine, all of that implies that this must be a supremely powerful being who can then construct such a sophisticated mechanism.
Yeah.
4, we know that since information is not material, this sender must at least have some non-material component.
Right.
And then 5, we know that man also sends information. There must be some non-material component to man.
Yeah, agree.
Okay. Okay, and now he's drawing some more practical conclusions. 6, materialism is false because we know that there's this thing called information. So materialism is false.
Yeah, that's true. So we cannot misunderstand the quickening of information into actual physical processes as the information itself. I mean, sure, information is stored, but it cannot. There must be someone there who writes the information in, right? It cannot be somehow emerged from itself.
Yes. And then 7. So there's actually only 7 conclusions, and which comes in 2 parts. The first part is Oh, sorry. No, it is one part. Anyone who disagrees with the laws and conclusions we've already achieved thus far must falsify them by demonstrating the initial origin of information from purely material sources. That's what they'd have to do to refute what's been said.
Yeah, because like let's go back to abiogenesis. If you think that like nucleic acids, amino acids all emerge from electrical discharges in the atmosphere and hot temperatures and everything, and that creates conditions that comes up with that forms at one point the primary building blocks of life, then you still haven't explained how everything then goes into one direction of productive evolution, right? So you can always say, it always go. There's always a direction towards it. And mind you, um, we have, as I mentioned before, with the example of amino acids that are put into proteins, that all of the amino acids are one form out of two possible forms, and how that can happen, like in the whole world, you would assume that there's not just like one little puddle of primordial ooze, but more over the entire world, how they can be all the same. That means there must be some kind of structure. And if it's not, if there's random fluctuations that are stabilized, since they're stabilized in a biased way, apparently, there must have been some structure by the environment before, right? Even Darwinism would say, even any other form of evolution would say there's environmental influences. So if life can emerge and become more complex by random fluctuations that are then somehow the productive fluctuations are then boosted up. Yeah, but there must the information then be in the environment. Otherwise, you cannot have clear information emerge out of a random process. So you always
Yeah.
end up with some kind of with some kind of some kind of blueprint.
Well, the other thing too with information that we can use to show that it's through some sort of test that it's not physical is it doesn't exist anywhere in space. So if I had a GPS tracker on you, Florian, I could determine exactly where you are on a longitudinal plot. Where would the information of your thoughts be? Not in space. I can't pinpoint them in space. And furthermore, as I said with the SOS example, so remember, why is that important? We have a rule in physics that two objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time. So if you have a ball and it's in a certain coordinate plane, you can't have another ball on the same spot unless you move in the time dimension. Otherwise, the space has already been taken, right? But what we have now is, with my SOS example, something in three different places where there's already material things taking up the spatial coordinates. So therefore, whatever it is, it can't be physical. Because another corollary to physical objects is they can't exist in more places than one at a time.
Yeah, it's possible that maybe information exists in the like makes up the fifth dimension. That's some form of or another dimension. That's some form of information, and that interacts with our universe in some way, shape, or form. Like for example, we have the experiments where you have quantum teleportation, where you have the state of a microparticle aligning with the state of another microparticle over a distance, right? So there's some form of information that exists on different places, but it basically gets put into material information at the very same time in different places all at once.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, it could be a higher dimension, but given the laws that we understand, information is not acting like the material objects that we engage with
Yes,
in
no,
in,
it
in
doesn't.
daily life. Yeah, and so all of these arguments are cumulative, and the only one that he mentioned specifically was the one about deleting a hard drive. But all of these cumulatively create a very powerful argument to reinforce what Viner already said, that this isn't a matter or energy, which then creates a lot of implications. The another implication we mentioned. the ordering process. You mentioned it earlier. Entropy. Yeah, you said that information is anti-entropic. It goes against entropy.
Right.
The the other thing, except for biological processes, I think all other natural processes are entropic, right? They just degrade over time, right? So obviously with a biological process, you can give birth to new life, which then reduces entropy within a certain area, right?
Yes.
But if we just look at biological processes though, or natural, I should say, for example, chemistry and physics, unaided by human interference, I don't think they have any reverse entropy characteristics, do they?
It's possible it wouldn't violate the first law of thermodynamics, but it clearly would violate the second law of thermodynamics. And if you wish, you can say basically, okay, let's say you have a you, let's say you have a bookshelf that you want to clean up, and so you order that bookshelf more, right? You put energy into it, work, and you make the bookshelf nicer than before, and now there's more information in the bookshelf. The entropy in that bookshelf has diminished, and we can all imagine that now, at least for a brief moment of time, the surrounding of that bookshelf has become a little bit more disordered, right? So, or if we put a new book in there, then we put it out of its cover and put the cover to the side. That's some disorder, and so on and so forth. And that's how I always thought about entropy, right? Um, Within there are islands of anti-entropy or information within a system, but overall the entire system becomes more disordered. And even when you think, oh, this is a process that goes from disordered to ordered, no, it's only possible when either another process becomes more disordered, or if you put actual energy into it. So a process is there's an important law in chemistry which says a process occurs when the overall free enthalpy um, of the end product becomes lower than the beginning product, right? So the enthalpy is a combined term between entropy, disorder, and energy, right? So if you burn a paper, then the products of that you have before and after you burn the paper, the products that you have after you burn the paper have a lower energy than the paper itself had, and but you can also put a paper back together, but then that's only possible as a process if the overall entropy of the entire system increases, right? So
Yeah.
so you can also have a chemical process or any other process that takes place if you put energy into it, but then the entropy becomes the entropy increases. So that's two ways that a reaction can take place. Like the end product, like and you either free energy, right? The end products of the system have a lower energy than the system had before because that energy has now been freed. Like if you roll a ball downhill, the ball had energy stored, potential energy. It rolls downhill. It speeds up. It has now kinetic energy, right? It has less potential energy than it had before. That is one
Yeah.
way a ball can spontaneously roll down a mountain. Or if you have a process where you need to put energy in, but then the overall entropy of the system gets larger, right? That's also those are the two things that allow processes to uh, to to occur. And um, and the law is directed in such a way that in the end you always need, I mean, increasing entropy is in the end always a bigger driver than freeing energy. So
Yeah.
yeah, in the end entropy always increases.
So then this is related to the lecture, but not exactly in the lecture, but it's an important point to make, and it's this. If that's the case, then the universe should be degrading from an ordered position. But that's not what the Big Bang Theory postulates. Doesn't that pose a problem?
Well, the Big Bang Theory, so order is it manifests itself as some like less information if a certain system is more disordered, like if biological matter decays. So, but in information theory, disorder just means, or higher entropy just means you have a higher ensemble of microstates, right? If you take the Big Bang, everything is glued together, nothing moves, and now everything expands all of a sudden. And now you get out of like one object, you get a gazillion of objects, each of which rotate and vibrate and move. So you basically explode the number of microstates that the system can have. So basically, you go from a very ordered point to to complete chaos afterwards, or or complete maybe not chaos, but a disordered way. Like you free all the atoms that can move freely, rotate, and whatever they want.
Well,
So
I mean,
that's how you explain it.
would you agree it's a simple state, right? It's a simple state, and that it's not composed of all these different pieces, right?
Right, but if you count the number of microstates that can occur before the Big Bang, that number is much smaller than you have after the Big Bang has occurred.
Right, but if we look at, say, a house over 2 centuries, it's not kept up. It runs down into something that's just junk. And
Yes.
so if you see the junk, you're not going to assume, oh, hey, this junk is going to then start ordering itself back into the house. No,
Exactly. Yeah.
you're going to assume that there was an already built house by somebody that you don't know who, but they built the house, and then it degraded down into whatever you have when you see the ruins of this building centuries later. And you know,
Yeah, well, the Big Bang, in that way, the Big Bang can be explained by entropy, but it becomes a little, but then the quickening of these atoms and putting back together in the form of stars and planets, that would be a more spontaneous ordering process that takes place, right? And so then overall, the sum of this order must still increase more strongly then you take a little bit of disorder away from the system by forming a planet or by forming a star, but then overall disorder of the universe must increase.
but my question is, where is the ordering principle coming from, though? Because when a human being reduces entropy, they expend energy to then create something, and that reduces entropy in that spot. Whereas I don't know what anti-entropic force is being posited, say at Planck time. I'm not aware of any.
Well, the explanation would be that the ordering processes, they would release energy, but it doesn't. Of course, it doesn't say how certain things have to be ordered, right? What we're talking about, the information on the level of on the level of biological life, is much different from just the fusion of some planets. I mean, that's one thing, yeah, right? What I also mentioned like a couple weeks ago. You can come up with mathematical equations to describe the development and the evolution, if you will, of space. You can do that because the sun basically lives on protons and neutrons and hydrogen atoms that are fused to helium together. That is much less complex. That's a much easier process than having life emerge from a lifeless planet, right? So you can so these small local ordering processes where you have disorder um, coming together at some point to form a star or form a like celestial object. That's a much easier process than bringing information into a system to create life. Life is much more complex, and becomes very difficult to say, these atoms just somehow spontaneously form together because it's an energetically favorable construct and it's an energetic favorable process, and somehow they all come together. It's very difficult to imagine that that's just some spontaneous ordering process because the end products are energetically more favorable. I think there is a difference, and not everything not everything uh, that builds order can do so spontaneously, right? So that's how I would explain it.
Okay, I want to get back to the import of ascender, because while it's true, so part of it is there's the question of God versus no God. But then there's another layer, even within the theist camp. Sometimes God is just seen as a force, or God is just seen as impersonal, so like Buddhism or Hinduism, or God is seen as equal to the universe, pantheism, right? But when you say that the creator of the universe, i.e., God, is a sender, you're also saying he's a person, because persons are the ones who send things, because the sender has a mind, the sender is a person, and then therefore the sender is the one sending the information. So this is actually really important. It's not just saying that we have a God, any sort of God will do. It's a God who's personal, because a lot of the debate in theology between different world religions is God a person? And this is interesting because looking at the sort of scientific evidence from information theory, he's concluding, or rather, we can conclude from what he concluded, that because the creator of the universe is a sender, that creator must also be a person.
Right, or at least it must be some entity, right? It must be some way, um, um, some some form with some form of, or some person in whatever way, shape, or form, because it is capable of sending a certain information, or releasing a certain set of rules, however you understand what the sender does in detail. Yeah.
So I think somebody from the chat was trying to ask you a question. Not Salmon Fish says, "Hey, Florian, Team Love has absolute proof of our way and system of life now with hard math and logic that leads to business and warfare advantage at a level insuperably deep." So that was for you, I guess.
Yeah, Team Love, yeah. Team Love is Team Love as long as you're on the side of Team Love. But if you anger Team Love, it's not a kind goddess. Team Love. Yeah.
No. But that's what's interesting though, is that you can then conclude from that God's a person. And when you get to the fact that God's a person, see, because here's this is what this whole broader topic is. Within Christian apologetics is a concept called natural theology, which is what can we learn about God from observing nature? Because for a lot of people, the unique claim of Christianity is that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, who said that he was God and that he would die and rise again, and that salvation is through him. Nobody else has a prophet that says that. But for many people, the problem is, well, all of the truths that you have to assent to about God to be a Christian just seems so far removed from people. And what natural theology does is it's like, well, look, we can actually prove a lot of these propositions about the nature of God from nature, which you would expect if God's the creator. And that helps close the gap. Now, it doesn't, and this is what I liked about Gitt's lecture. He says that there's an epistemic limit to science. You can't prove Christianity with science, but you can prove principles that are necessary to be believed before you become a Christian.
Yeah, but they don't make up the entire Christianity.
Yes, that's correct. But what this does though, is it helps people realize that Christianity is reasonable and that Christianity can rest on what we know about science in the physical world.
Yeah.
And I think that that's why this is a really good lecture, because he really does show that in a way that, we can show all of these points about, God through information, which creates a sort of bedrock of belief, a preamble of belief that could be built upon to lead to Christianity. I think that was important as well. Let's see if there's anything else you want to dive into here on.
But I mean, it's also important that the sender must be a person, but the sender must also be non-material, right? It's more like a spirit than an actual material person.
Right. So when I say person, I mean this in a specific philosophical sense. It's called FPP, first person perspective. And so the argument, if an animal looks at itself in a mirror and a reflection, it doesn't realize it's looking at itself. They will often take defensive postures and become aggressive. A human being who has a first person perspective can look in the mirror and see that is him. Spirit beings, angels, demons, jinn, God, whatever, gods, they would all be persons as well, because they have that level of awareness about them. So when I say person, I mean something specific, and it could be a completely disembodied mind or spirit.
Yeah, and it's I think that's where the thought of demons possessing people always comes from, right? Some demons possess people, so basically they need some form of they need some form of suit to interact with matter, right? They need to inhabit a certain body. They can't become a body unto themselves.
Yeah. So real quick, we got a comment from Yiz, which I think is good. The point with the sender is that God isn't a force of nature. He is a sentience with goals, ideas, desires, plans, etc.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well
Yes.
said.
That's a very nice summary of what's being said here. So, no, yeah, that was great. Yes, thanks. And let's see. There's, like I said, a lot here. Oh, also too, the reason why he focuses on God's omniscience and omnipotence is obviously that's a part of the Christian conception of God. If these information density points of DNA are so vastly greater than what we humans can do, whatever this being is must be supremely intelligent. So, for lack of a better word, this being is omniscient, right? Uh, and then he also says that this being must be omniscient to avoid infinite regress. He talks about the God, the over God, the over God, the over God, and it's like, well, you can't do that forever. So you just say, well, there's one God who's omniscient, who already has all these properties, and that's a common philosophical assumption that goes back to Aristotle. You can't have infinite regresses.
Yeah, yeah, infinite kicking the can down the road, right? Infinite regress.
So that's an important conclusion that he draws from this work.
And
And then,
I
good.
think we can also I think we solve that dilemma with seeing God as some kind of spiritual person, spiritual being, because the infinite regress comes from a materialistic point, right? Cause and effect. But if God is anything that interacts with matter but isn't matter itself, then it's much easier to see that it could be just an that it could be an omniscient being, right? That doesn't really have a beginning and an end.
Right. Okay. So we have a question from HG. Why can't you do it forever? Any reasons provided? So the short, direct answer is this. Leibniz pointed out that there are two causes of an object. The cause could be external to the object, so a mother and a father are the cause of the child, or the cause is the necessity of the object itself or internal to itself, i.e., God, which in theological terms is called aseity, necessary being. And so, if everything in the universe that existed depended upon something else for its existence, how could it ever start? It couldn't. It couldn't start. There's no way. The child can't beget itself, right? It has to be begotten by parents. But that has to be. You keep going back and back and back, and it's like, well, okay, where do you get that? You have to have some being whose existence, whose own existence explains itself, right? It's not external to itself; it's internal to itself.
Well, in a way, if you look at fractal mathematics, where you have these figures that have like small branches, and when you zoom in further and further, then there's more small branches, and they seem to seem to spring from the previous branch, and it's basically infinitely branched form. Then there's a certain mathematical law that undermines the generation of it, right? It cannot just beget a new being just from itself. There's a certain law that means it can infinitely be born and die on its own. But then there's still some creator that put that mathematical law there.
Yeah. Uh, HG has a follow up question. Didn't it just depend on the state of the universe that was before? Well, the reason why the universe or some other physical thing can't be this supreme being is entropy. If because on a long enough time frame, we get to the heat death of the universe because all the energy is uniformly distributed throughout the universe. So if the universe were eternally old, we would already be in the state of heat death. We are not in the state of heat death, therefore the universe is not eternally old. And any metaverse, any other physical any other physical process that is subjected to entropy would have already ceased to be an ordered system. So it has to be immaterial. And the other reason why it has to be material, I don't know when you jumped in, HG, is information itself isn't material. So the code in the DNA cannot be material either. So there's actually two reasons for that. Anything you want to add, Florian?
No, that's explains it well. Aren't, and that may be something you know, Todd, but aren't the LDS folks, I mean, probably Latter-day Saint folks, fans of an infinite regress or progress?
Oh, I see that, Middleton Walker. I don't know what they view about the eternality of the. They don't believe in a single supreme being. That might be what Middleton Walker's getting at. For them, the God of the Bible, Yahweh, is just a man. There was a saying amongst Mormons, I think they still have it. God was once as we are, and we will one day be as God is now. Which means he's actually a material being. I mean, the God of the Mormons procreates, he does all sorts of things. That's a lowercase g God. That's not the God of Christianity or even any of the Abrahamic faiths, which is this supreme being that exists necessarily. But again, I'm not really fully informed on LDS theology to say much more than that.
Okay, yeah, interesting.
So yeah, I think we've covered Git's lecture. Is there anything else you want to add, Florian, before I wrap
I think
up?
no, yeah, no. It's fantastic lecture, really good, really interesting. One of the topics that like rolls itself out the more you think about it. It may sound simple at first, and you think it's more like information theory, and that's very formulaic. But then you realize what it actually all implies, and you get awestruck. Like knowing that the hard drive example I found the most compelling. I mean, knowing that you have a hard drive and it's basically just an ensemble of different microscopic gates, and the gate switches from left or right depending whether you have an information on that block or not. But it's not changed. That there's no material change in the hard drive itself. That's mind-boggling. And even magnetic tapes. What magnetic tapes are? They just become. You just order the magnetic tapes from being all aligned in one direction to having a certain pattern there, right? So that's what happens with cassette tapes. For those of you in the audience who still know them. So yeah, basically, there's no difference in weight in these mediums either. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, I'll just say when I first saw this lecture, I love the German rigor, the precise definitions, the logical procedure. That was really just that makes it for a really powerful delivery.
Yeah, that's true. I agree.
Well, all right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you again, Florian. Always a pleasure having you on. It's Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Five podcast, signing off.